Good evening, and welcome to Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's installment provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep for once. So lie back, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath, and off we go. This evening, we're relaxing with some random selections from one of the world's first attempts at an encyclopedia, The Natural History of Pliny the Elder, translated with copious notes and illustrations by the late John Bostock, M.D., F.R.S., and H.T. Riley, Esquire, B.A., late Scholar of Clare Hall, Cambridge. Published by Henry G. Bonn, York Street, Covent Garden, London, in 1855. Let's begin. Preface. The only translation of Pliny's Natural History which has hitherto appeared in the English language is that by Philemon Holland, published in the latter part of the reign of Elizabeth. It is no disparagement to Holland's merits as a diligent and generally faithful translator to say that his work is unsuited to the requirements of the 19th century. In the present translation, the principal editions of Pliny have been carefully consulted, and no pains have been spared, as a reference to the notes will show, to present to the reader the labors of recent commentators, among whom stands preeminent the celebrated Cuvier. It has been a primary object to bring to the illustration of the work whatever was afforded by the progress of knowledge and modern discoveries in science and art. Without ample illustration, Pliny's valuable work would want much of the interest which belongs to it, and present difficulties scarcely surmountable by anyone who has not made the author his especial study. In the first two books, the text of Hardouin, as given in Lemaire's edition, Paris 1827, has been followed. In the remainder, that of Sillig, Gotha 1851-53, excepting in some few instances where, for reasons given in the notes, it has been deemed advisable to depart from it. The first two books, and portions of others, are the performance of the late Dr. Bostock, who contemplated a translation of the entire work, but, unfortunately for the interests of science, he was not permitted to carry his design into execution. Upwards of 100 pages had been printed off before the present translator entered on his duties, and as they had not the advantage of Dr. Bostock's superintendence through the press, some trifling oversights have occurred. These are, for the most part, corrected in a short appendix. The Natural History of Pliny the Elder, Book 1, Dedication. Gaius Plinius Secundus to his friend Titus Vespasian. This treatise on natural history, a novel work in Roman literature which I have just completed, I have taken the liberty to dedicate to you, most gracious Emperor, an appellation peculiarly suitable to you, while on account of his age, that of great is more appropriate to your father. For still thou ne'er wouldst quite despise the trifles that I write, if I may be allowed to shelter myself under the example of Catullus, my fellow countryman, a military term which you well understand. For he, as you know, when his napkins had to be changed, expressed himself a little harshly from his anxiety to show his friendship for his dear little Veranius and Fabius. At the same time, this my importunity may effect what you complained of my not having done in another too forward epistle of mine. It will put upon record, and let all the world know with what kindness you exercise the imperial dignity. You, who have had the honor of a triumph and of the censorship, have been 6 times consul, and have shared in the tribunate. And what is still more honorable, whilst you held them in conjunction with your father, you have presided over the equestrian order, and been the prefect of the praetorians. All this you have done for the service of the Republic, and at the same time have regarded me as a fellow soldier and a messmate. Nor has the extent of your prosperity produced any change in you, except that it has given you the power of doing good to the utmost of your wishes. And whilst all these circumstances increase the veneration which other persons feel for you with respect to myself, they have made me so bold as to wish to become more familiar. You must, therefore, place this to your own account, and blame yourself for any fault of this kind that I may commit. But although I have laid aside my blushes, I have not gained my object, for you still awe me, and keep me at a distance by the majesty of your understanding. In no one does the force of eloquence and of tribunician oratory blaze out more powerfully. With what glowing language do you thunder forth the praises of your father? How dearly do you love your brother? How admirable is your talent for poetry? What a fertility of genius do you possess, so as to enable you to imitate your brother? But who is there that is bold enough to form an estimate on these points, if he is to be judged by you, and more especially if you are challenged to do so? For the case of those who merely publish their works is very different from that of those who expressly dedicate them to you. In the former case, I might say, Emperor, why do you read these things? They are written only for the common people, for farmers or mechanics, or for those who have nothing else to do. Why do you trouble yourself with them? Indeed, when I undertook this work, I did not expect that you would sit in judgment upon me. I considered your situation much too elevated for you to descend to such an office. Besides, we possess the right of openly rejecting the opinion of men of learning. Marcus Tullius himself, whose genius is beyond all competition, uses this privilege, and, remarkable as it may appear, employs an advocate in his own defense. Quote, I do not write for very learned people. I do not wish my works to be read by Manius Persius, but by Junius Congus." End quote. And if Lucilius, who first introduced the satirical style, applied such a remark to himself, and if Cicero thought proper to borrow it, and that more especially in his treatise De Republica, how much reason have I to do so, who have such a judge to defend myself against? And by this dedication I have deprived myself of the benefit of challenge, for it is a very different thing whether a person has a judge given him by lot, or whether he voluntarily selects one. And we always make more preparation for an invited guest than for one that comes in unexpectedly. When the candidates for office, during the heat of the canvass, deposited the fine in the hands of Cato, that determined opposer of bribery, rejoicing as he did in his being rejected from what he considered to be foolish honors, they professed to do this out of respect to his integrity, the greatest glory which a man could attain. It was on this occasion that Cicero uttered the noble ejaculation, quote, "How happy are you, Marcus Porcius, of whom no one dares to ask what is dishonorable." End quote. When Scipio Asiaticus appealed to the tribunes, among whom was Gracchus, he expressed full confidence that he should obtain an acquittal, even from a judge who was his enemy. Hence it follows that he who appoints his own judge must absolutely submit to the decision. This choice is therefore termed an appeal. I am well aware that, placed as you are in the highest station, and gifted with the most splendid eloquence and the most accomplished mind, even those who come to pay their respects to you do it with a kind of veneration. On this account, I ought to be careful that what is dedicated to you should be worthy of you. But the country people, and indeed some whole nations, offer milk to the gods, and those who cannot procure frankincense substitute in its place salted cakes, for the gods are not dissatisfied when they are worshipped by everyone to the best of his ability. But my temerity will appear the greater by the consideration that these volumes which I dedicate to you are of such inferior importance, for they do not admit of the display of genius, nor indeed is mine one of the highest order. They admit of no excursions, nor orations, nor discussions, nor of any wonderful adventures, nor any variety of transactions, nor, from the barrenness of the matter, of anything particularly pleasant in the narration or agreeable to the reader. The nature of things, and life as it actually exists, are described in them, and often the lowest department of it, so that in very many cases I am obliged to use rude and foreign or even barbarous terms, and these often require to be introduced by a kind of preface. And besides this, my road is not a beaten track, nor one which the mind is much disposed to travel over. There is no one among us who has ever attempted it, nor is there any one individual among the Greeks who has treated of all the topics. Most of us seek for nothing but amusement in our studies, while others are fond of subjects that are of excessive subtlety and completely involved in obscurity. My object is to treat of all those things which the Greeks include in the encyclopedia, which, however, are either not generally known or are rendered dubious from our ingenious conceits. And there are other matters which many writers have given so much in detail that we quite loathe them. It is indeed no easy task to give novelty to what is old, and authority to what is new, brightness to what is become tarnished, and light to what is obscure, to render what is slighted acceptable, and what is doubtful worthy of our confidence, to give to all a natural manner, and to each its peculiar nature. It is sufficiently honorable and glorious to have been willing even to make the attempt, although it should prove unsuccessful. And indeed, I am of opinion that the studies of those are more especially worthy of our regard, who, after having overcome all difficulties, prefer the useful office of assisting others to the mere gratification of giving pleasure. And this is what I have already done in some of my former works. I confess it surprises me that Titus Livius, so celebrated an author as he is, in one of the books of his history of the city from its origin, should begin with this remark, quote, "I have now obtained a sufficient reputation so that I might put an end to my work, did not my restless mind require to be supported by employment." End quote. Certainly he ought to have composed this work, not for his own glory, but for that of the Roman name, and of the people who were the conquerors of all other nations. It would have been more meritorious to have persevered in his labors from his love of the work than from the gratification which it afforded him, and to have accomplished it not for his own sake, but for that of the Roman people. I have included in 36 books 20,000 topics, all worthy of attention. For, as Domitius Piso says, we ought to make not merely books, but valuable collections, gained by the perusal of about 2,000 volumes, of which a few only are in the hands of the studious on account of the obscurity of the subjects, procured by the careful perusal of 100 select authors. And to these I have made considerable additions of things which were either not known to my predecessors or which have been lately discovered. Nor can I doubt but that there still remain many things which I have omitted, for I am a mere mortal and one that has many occupations. I have therefore been obliged to compose this work at interrupted intervals, indeed during the night, so that you will find that I have not been idle even during this period. The day I devote to you, exactly portioning out my sleep to the necessity of my health, and contenting myself with this reward, that while we are musing on these subjects, according to the remark of Varro, we are adding to the length of our lives, for life properly consists in being awake. In consideration of these circumstances and these difficulties, I dare promise nothing, but you have done me the most essential service in permitting me to dedicate my work to you. Nor does this merely give a sanction to it, but it determines its value, for things are often conceived to be of great value solely because they are consecrated in temples. I have given a full account of all your family, your father, yourself, and your brother, in a history of our own times, beginning where Aufidius Bassus concludes. You will ask, where is it? It has been long completed, and its accuracy confirmed, but I have determined to commit the charge of it to my heirs, lest I should have been suspected during my lifetime of having been unduly influenced by ambition. By this means I confer an obligation on those who occupy the same ground with myself, and also on posterity, who I am aware will contend with me as I have done with my predecessors. You may judge of my taste from my having inserted in the beginning of my book the names of the authors that I have consulted, for I consider it to be courteous and to indicate an ingenuous modesty, to acknowledge the sources whence we have derived assistance, and not to act as most of those have done whom I have examined. For I must inform you that in comparing various authors with each other, I have discovered that some of the most grave and of the latest writers have transcribed word for word from former works, without making any acknowledgment, not avowedly rivaling them in the manner of Virgil, or with the candor of Cicero, who in his treatise De Republica professes to coincide in opinion with Plato, and in his essay on consolation for his daughter says that he follows Crantor, and in his offices Panaetius, volumes which, as you well know, ought not merely to be always in our hands, but to be learned by heart. For it is indeed the mark of a perverted mind and a bad disposition to prefer being caught in a theft to returning what we have borrowed, especially when we have acquired capital by usurious interest. The Greeks were wonderfully happy in their titles. One work they called as sweet as a honeycomb, another cornucopia, so that you might expect to get even a draught of pigeon's milk from it. Then they have their flowers, their muses, magazines, manuals, gardens, pictures, and sketches, all of them titles for which a man might be tempted even to forfeit his bail. But when you enter upon the works, O ye gods and goddesses, how full of emptiness! Our duller countrymen have merely their antiquities, or their examples, or their arts. I think one of the most humorous of them has his nocturnal studies, a term employed by Bibaculus, a name which he richly deserved. Varro, indeed, is not much behind him when he calls one of his satires a trick and a half, and another turning the tables. Diodorus was the first among the Greeks who laid aside this trifling manner and named his history the Library. Appian the grammarian, indeed, he whom Tiberius Caesar called the trumpeter of the world, but would rather seem to be the bell of the town crier, supposed that every one to whom he inscribed any work would thence acquire immortality. I do not regret not having given my work a more fanciful title. That I may not, however, appear to inveigh so completely against the Greeks, I should wish to be considered under the same point of view with those inventors of the arts of painting and sculpture, of whom you will find an account in these volumes, whose works, although they are so perfect that we are never satisfied with admiring them, are inscribed with a temporary title, such as Apelles or Polycletus was doing this, implying that the work was only commenced and still imperfect, and that the artist might benefit by the criticisms that were made on it, and alter any part that required it if he had not been prevented by death. It is also a great mark of their modesty that they inscribed their works as if they were the last which they had executed, and as still in hand at the time of their death. I think there are but 3 works of art which are inscribed positively with the words, "Such a one executed this." Of these I shall give an account in the proper place. In these cases it appears that the artist felt the most perfect satisfaction with his work, and hence these pieces have excited the envy of everyone. I indeed freely admit that much may be added to my works, not only to this, but to all which I have published. By this admission I hope to escape from the carping critics, and I have the more reason to say this because I hear that there are certain Stoics and logicians, and also Epicureans. From the grammarians I expected as much, who are big with something against the little work I published on grammar. But I well know that even a woman once wrote against Theophrastus, a man so eminent for his eloquence that he obtained his name, which signifies the divine speaker, and that from this circumstance originated the proverb of choosing a tree to hang oneself. I cannot refrain from quoting the words of Cato the censor, which are so pertinent to this point. It appears from them that even Cato, who wrote commentaries on military discipline, and who had learned the military art under Africanus, or rather under Hannibal, for he could not endure Africanus, who when he was his general had borne away the triumph from him. That Cato, I say, was open to the attacks of such as caught at reputation for themselves by detracting from the merits of others. And what does he say in his book? Quote, "I know that when I shall publish what I have written, there will be many who will do all they can to depreciate it, and especially such as are themselves void of all merit, but I let their harangues glide by me." End quote. Nor was the remark of Plancus a bad one, when Asinius Pollio was said to be preparing an oration against him, which was to be published either by himself or his children after the death of Plancus. in order that he might not be able to answer it. It is only ghosts that fight with the dead. This gave such a blow to the oration that in the opinion of the learned generally, nothing was ever thought more scandalous. Feeling myself, therefore, secure against these vile slanderers, a name elegantly composed by Cato to express their slanderous and vile disposition, for what other object have they but to wrangle and breed quarrels? I will proceed with my projected work. And because the public good requires that you should be spared as much as possible from all trouble, I have subjoined to this epistle the contents of each of the following books, and have used my best endeavors to prevent you being obliged to read them all through. And this, which was done for your benefit, will also serve the same purpose for others, so that anyone may search for what he wishes, and may know where to find it. This has been already done among us by Valerius Soranus in his work which he entitled On Mysteries. The first book is the preface of the work, dedicated to Titus Vespasian Caesar. The second is on the world, the elements, and the heavenly bodies. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth books are on geography, in which is contained an account of the situation of the different countries, the inhabitants, the seas, towns, harbors, mountains, rivers, and dimensions, and the various tribes, some of which still exist, and others have disappeared. The seventh is on man and the inventions of man. The eighth on the various kinds of land animals. The ninth on aquatic animals. The 10th on the various kinds of birds. The 11th on insects. The 12th on odoriferous plants. The 13th on exotic trees. The 14th on vines. The 15th on fruit trees. The 16th on forest trees. The 17th on plants raised in nurseries or gardens. The 18th on the nature of fruits and the cerealia and the pursuits of the husbandman. The 19th on flax, broom, and gardening. The 20th on the cultivated plants that are proper for food and for medicine. The 21st on flowers and plants that are used for making garlands. The 22nd on garlands and medicines made from plants. The 23rd on medicines made from wine and from cultivated trees. The 24th on medicines made from forest trees. The 25th on medicines made from wild plants. The 26th on new diseases and medicines made for certain diseases from plants. The 27th on some other plants and medicines. The 28th on medicines procured from man and from large animals. The 29th on medical authors and on medicines from other animals. The 30th on magic and medicines for certain parts of the body. the 31st on medicines from aquatic animals, the 32nd on the other properties of aquatic animals, the 33rd on gold and silver, the 34th on copper and lead and the workers of copper, the 35th on painting, colors, and painters, the 36th on marbles and stones, and the 37th on gems. Book 2, Chapter 1. Whether the world be finite, and whether there be more than one world. The world, and whatever that be which we otherwise call the heavens, by the vault of which all things are enclosed, we must conceive to be a deity, to be eternal, without bounds, neither created nor subject at any time to destruction. To inquire what is beyond it is no concern of man, nor can the human mind form any conjecture respecting it. It is sacred, eternal, and without bounds, all in all, indeed, including everything in itself, finite, yet like what is infinite, the most certain of all things, yet like what is uncertain, externally and internally embracing all things in itself. It is the work of nature, and itself constitutes nature. It is madness to harass the mind, as some have done, with attempts to measure the world and to publish these attempts, or, like others, to argue from what they have made out, that there are innumerable other worlds, and that we must believe there to be so many other natures, or that, if only one nature produced the whole, there will be so many suns and so many moons, and that each of them will have immense trains of other heavenly bodies, as if the same question would not recur at every step of our inquiry, anxious as we must be to arrive at some termination, or as if this infinity which we ascribe to nature, the former of all things, cannot be more easily comprehended by one single formation, especially when that is so extensive. It is madness, perfect madness, to go out of this world and to search for what is beyond it, as if one who is ignorant of his own dimensions could ascertain the measure of anything else, or as if the human mind could see what the world itself cannot contain. Book 2, Chapter 2, of the form of the world. That it has the form of a perfect globe we learn from the name which has been uniformly given to it, as well as from numerous natural arguments. For not only does a figure of this kind return everywhere into itself and sustain itself, also including itself, requiring no adjustments, not sensible of either end or beginning in any of its parts, and is best fitted for that motion with which, as will appear hereafter, it is continually turning round. But still more, because we perceive it by the evidence of the sight to be in every part convex and central, which could not be the case were it of any other figure. Book 2, Chapter 5 of God. I consider it an indication of human weakness to inquire into the figure and form of God. For whatever God be, if there be any other God, and wherever he exists, he is all sense, all sight, all hearing, all life, all mind, and all within himself. To believe that there are a number of gods derived from the virtues and vices of man, as chastity, concord, understanding, hope, honor, clemency, and fidelity, or, according to the opinion of Democritus, that there are only two, punishment and reward, indicates still greater folly. Human nature, weak and frail as it is, mindful of its own infirmity, has made these divisions, so that everyone might have recourse to that which he supposed himself to stand more particularly in need of. Hence we find different names employed by different nations. The inferior deities are arranged in classes, and diseases and plagues are deified in consequence of our anxious wish to propitiate them. It was from this cause that a temple was dedicated to Fever at the public expense on the Palatine Hill, and to Orbona near the temple of the Lares, and that an altar was elected to Good Fortune on the Esquiline. Hence we may understand how it comes to pass that there is a greater population of the celestials than of human beings, since each individual makes a separate god for himself, adopting his own Juno and his own genius. And there are nations who make gods of certain animals, and even certain obscene things which are not to be spoken of, swearing by stinking meats and such like. To suppose that marriages are contracted between the gods, and that during so long a period there should have been no issue from them, that some of them should be old and always gray-headed, and others young and like children, some of a dark complexion, winged, lame, produced from eggs, living and dying on alternate days, is sufficiently puerile and foolish. But it is the height of impudence to imagine that adultery takes place between them, that they have contests and quarrels, and that there are gods of theft and of various crimes. To assist man is to be a god. This is the path to eternal glory. This is the path which the Roman nobles formerly pursued, and this is the path which is now pursued by the greatest ruler of our age, Vespasian Augustus, he who has come to the relief of an exhausted empire, as well as by his sons. This was the ancient mode of remunerating those who deserved it, to regard them as gods. For the names of all the gods, as well as of the stars that I have mentioned above, have been derived from their services to mankind. And with respect to Jupiter and Mercury, and the rest of the celestial nomenclature, who does not admit that they have reference to certain natural phenomena? But it is ridiculous to suppose that the great head of all things, whatever it be, pays any regard to human affairs. Can we believe, or rather can there be any doubt, that it is not polluted by such a disagreeable and complicated office. It is not easy to determine which opinion would be most for the advantage of mankind, since we observe some who have no respect for the gods, and others who carry it to a scandalous excess. They are slaves to foreign ceremonies. They carry on their fingers the gods and the monsters whom they worship. They condemn and they lay great stress on certain kinds of food. They impose on themselves dreadful ordinances, not even sleeping quietly. They do not marry or adopt children, or indeed do anything else without the sanction of their sacred rites. There are others, on the contrary, who will cheat in the very capital, and will forswear themselves even by Jupiter Tonans. And while these thrive in their crimes, the others torment themselves with their superstitions to no purpose. Among these discordant opinions, mankind have discovered for themselves a kind of intermediate deity, by which our skepticism concerning God is still increased. For all over the world, in all places and at all times, Fortune is the only God whom every one invokes. She alone is spoken of. She alone is accused and is supposed to be guilty. She alone is in our thoughts, is praised and blamed, and is loaded with reproaches. Wavering as she is, conceived by the generality of mankind to be blind, wandering, inconstant, uncertain, variable, and often favoring the unworthy. To her are referred all our losses and all our gains, and in casting up the accounts of mortals, she alone balances the 2 pages of our sheet. We are so much in the power of chance that chance itself is considered as a god, and the existence of God becomes doubtful. But there are others who reject this principle and assign events to the influence of the stars and to the laws of our nativity. They suppose that God, once for all, issues his decrees and never afterwards interferes. This opinion begins to gain ground, and both the learned and the unlearned vulgar are falling into it. Hence we have the admonitions of thunder, the warnings of oracles, the predictions of soothsayers, and things too trifling to be mentioned, as sneezing and stumbling with the feet reckoned among omens. The late Emperor Augustus relates that he put the left shoe on the wrong foot the day when he was near being assaulted by his soldiers. And such things as these so embarrass improvident mortals that among all of them this alone is certain, that there is nothing certain, and that there is nothing more proud or more wretched than man. For other animals have no care but to provide for their subsistence, for which the spontaneous kindness of nature is all sufficient. And this one circumstance renders their lot more especially preferable, that they never think about glory, or money, or ambition, and above all, that they never reflect on death. The belief, however, that on these points the gods superintend human affairs is useful to us, as well as that the punishment of crimes, although sometimes tardy, from the deity being occupied with such a mass of business, is never entirely remitted, and that the human race was not made the next in rank to himself, in order that they might be degraded like brutes. And indeed, this constitutes the great comfort in this imperfect state of man, that even the deity cannot do everything, for he cannot procure death for himself, even if he wished it, which, so numerous are the evils of life, has been granted to man as our chief good. Nor can he make mortals immortal, or recall to life those who are dead, nor can he effect that he who has once lived shall not have lived, or that he who has enjoyed honors shall not have enjoyed them, nor has he any influence over past events but to cause them to be forgotten. And if we illustrate the nature of our connection with God by a less serious argument, he cannot make twice 10 not be 20, and many other things of this kind. By these considerations, the power of nature is clearly proved, and is shown to be what we call God. It is not foreign to the subject to have digressed into these matters, familiar as they are to everyone, from the continual discussions that take place respecting God. Book 8, Chapter 22. A man recognized and saved by a dragon. Facts such as these induce us to give some credit to what Democritus relates, who says that a man called Thoas was preserved in Arcadia by a dragon. When a boy, he had become much attached to it, and had reared it very tenderly. But his father, being alarmed at the nature and monstrous size of the reptile, had taken and left it in the desert. Thoas being here attacked by some robbers who lay in ambush, he was delivered from them by the dragon, which recognized his voice and came to his assistance. But as to what has been said respecting infants that have been exposed and nourished by the milk of wild beasts, as in the case of the founders of our city by a wolf, I am disposed to attribute such cases as these rather to the greatness of the destinies which have to be fulfilled than to any peculiarity in the nature of the animals themselves. Book 8, Chapter 30. The Lynx, the Sphinx, the Crocata, and the Monkey. Ethiopia produces the lynx in abundance, and the Sphinx, which has brown hair and 2 mammae on the breast, as well as many monstrous kinds of a similar nature. Horses with wings and armed with horns, which are called Pegasi. The Crocata, an animal which looks as though it had been produced by the union of the wolf and the dog, for it can break anything with its teeth, and instantly on swallowing it, digest it with the stomach. Monkeys too, with black heads, the hair of an ass, and a voice quite unlike that of any other animal. There are oxen too, like those of India, some with 1 horn, and others with 3. the lucrucata, a wild beast of extraordinary swiftness, the size of the wild ass, with the legs of a stag, the neck, tail, and breast of a lion, the head of a badger, a cloven hoof, the mouth slit up as far as the ears, and one continuous bone instead of teeth. It is said, too, that this animal can imitate the human voice. Among the same people, there is also found an animal called Ele. It is the size of the river horse, has the tail of the elephant, and is of a black or tawny color. It also has the jaws of the wild boar, and horns that are movable, and more than a cubit in length, so that in fighting it can employ them alternately, and vary their position by presenting them directly or obliquely, according as necessity may dictate. But the wild bulls which this country produces are the fiercest of all. They are larger than our domestic bull, and exceed all the others in swiftness, are of a tawny color with azure eyes, and the hair turned the contrary way, while the jaws open as far as the ears, and the horns are as movable as those of the ele. The hide of this animal is as hard as flint, and effectually resists all wounds. These creatures pursue all the other wild beasts, while they themselves can only be taken in pitfalls, where they always perish from excess of rage. Ctesias informs us that among these same Ethiopians there is an animal found which he calls the manticore. It has a triple row of teeth which fit into each other like those of a comb, the face and ears of a man, and azure eyes, is of the color of blood, has the body of the lion, and a tail ending in a sting like that of the scorpion. Book 10, Chapter 97, The Sleep of Animals. The question as to their sleep is one that is by no means difficult to solve. In the land animals, it is quite evident that all that have eyelids sleep. With reference to aquatic animals, it is admitted that they also sleep, though only for short periods, even by those writers who entertain doubts as to the other animals. And they come to this conclusion not from any appearance of the eyes, for they have no eyelids indeed to close, but because they are to be seen buried in deep repose, and to all appearance fast asleep, betraying no motion in any part of the body except the tail, and by starting when they happen to hear a noise. With regard to the tunny, it is stated with still greater confidence that it sleeps. Indeed, it is often found in that state near the shore or among the rocks. Flat fish are also found fast asleep in shallow water, and are often taken in that state with the hand. And as to the dolphin and the balena, they are even heard to snore. It is quite evident also that insects sleep, from the silent stillness which they preserve, and even if a light is put close to them, they will not be awoke thereby. Book 10, Chapter 98, What Animals are Subject to Dreams? Man, just after his birth, is hard pressed by sleep for several months, after which he becomes more and more wakeful day by day. The infant dreams from the very first, for it will suddenly awake with every symptom of alarm, and while asleep will imitate the action of sucking. There are some persons, however, who never dream. Indeed, we find instances stated where it has been a fatal sign for a person to dream who has never done so before. Here we find ourselves invited by a grand field of investigation, and one that is full of alleged proofs on both sides of the question, whether, when the mind is at rest in sleep, it has any foreknowledge of the future, and if so, by what process this is brought about, or whether this is not altogether a matter quite fortuitous, as most other things are. If we were to attempt to decide the question by instances quoted, we should find as many on the one side as on the other. It is pretty generally agreed that dreams, immediately after we have taken wine and food, or when we have just fallen asleep again after waking, have no signification whatever. Indeed, sleep is nothing else than the retiring of the mind into itself. It is quite evident that besides man, horses, dogs, oxen, sheep, and goats have dreams. Consequently, the same is supposed to be the case with all animals that are viviparous. As to those which are oviparous, it is a matter of uncertainty, though it is equally certain that they do sleep. And with 19,995 more entries to go, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Natural History of Pliny the Elder, translated by Dr. John Bostock and H.T. Riley, Esquire. I don't know about you, but I find any work that ranges from a description of the nature of God to the manticore pretty interesting. And we haven't even gotten to the medical uses of the hedgehog, so that's something to look forward to. If you'd like to read this fascinating work for yourself, I'll leave a link to a free ebook version from Project Gutenberg in the show description. You'll also find a link to our Patreon page, where this month's exclusive episode for subscribers will be another selection from this work, an essay on the life and writings of Pliny the Elder, with entries from the letters of his nephew, Pliny the Younger, including a description of Pliny the Elder's death during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii. It's remarkable. If you'd like to discuss this work or suggest a work you'd like to hear read, the best place to catch me is on Twitter at BoringBooksPod. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Until our next boring book, good night.